I should not have come back to Remedios Street. The rain isn't just falling, it's clawing at my coat, trying to peel me from this sagging porch like old paint. Night clothes are already a second skin, cold and heavy with sea salt, but that's not what chills me. It's the smell like wet rot and something faintly sweeter underneath. Ahead, the street stretches like a broken rib cage, and at its heart sits the only lit window for blocks, the boarding house. It waits. It always waits. Most of the buildings here are just skeletal shells now, their windows boarded up like the eyes of corpses. But that one is different. That one remembers me. It was a towering 3-story boarding house that leaned slightly to the left, as if exhausted by its own weight. Its facade was a jaundiced yellow, peeling in long strips like dead skin. I did not choose to stay there out of desire. I chose it because the alternative was being swept into the churning gray sea only a mile away. The sign hanging over the door groaned in the wind. It simply read, "The Gables." I pushed through the heavy oak door, and the transition from the howling gale to the interior silence was so sudden it made my ears ring. The air inside smelled of old wax, damp wood, and something sickly sweet like lilies left too long in a vase of stagnant water. A man sat behind a scarred mahogany desk in the foyer. He was thin enough that his skin looked translucent over his cheekbones. He did not look up from a ledger he was scribing with a feather pen. I told him I needed a room for the night. My voice sounded small and brittle against the heavy shadows of the hallway. The man took his time, his movements slow and deliberate. He did not speak until he had finished his entry in the book. Then he slid a rusted iron key across the counter. It was heavy in my hand, the metal pitted with corrosion. "Room 4B, he said. His voice was like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "Do not wander the halls after the clock strikes 10. The neighbors are sensitive to noise." I thanked him and retreated into the gloom of the corridor. The hallway was a long, narrow throat that stretched deep into the heart of the house. The wallpaper was a faded floral pattern, the roses now gray and moldy. Every few feet, a heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar, exhaling a faint draft of cold air. I could hear others inside, muffled thumps, the scrape of chairs, and the occasional low moan that I chose to interpret as the wind moving through the rafters. I reached my door and entered. The room was sparse, a bed with a threadbare quilt, a chair with a broken leg, and a wash basin. The window was small and reinforced with iron bars. Outside, the storm continued its assault, the glass rattling in its frame like teeth in a skull. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to calm my racing heart. The silence of the room was not peaceful. It felt expectant, as if the walls were holding their breath. I took out a small notebook and tried to write, but my hands trembled too much. Every few minutes, a distant thud would echo from above or below, a heavy, deliberate sound that made me flinch. I tried to focus on the scratching of my pen, but the smells began to haunt me again, that cloying, floral rot. It seemed to grow stronger in the corners of the ceiling, where the shadows pooled like ink. The clock in the hallway began to chime. It was a deep, metallic toll that vibrated in my chest. 1, 2, 3. It felt as though each stroke lasted longer than the last. By the 10th chime, I realized the sound wasn't just coming from the hall. It seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards beneath me. When it finished, the silence that followed was even heavier than before. It was a thick, suffocating weight that pressed against my eardrums. I lay down on the bed, pulling the quilt up to my chin. The fabric felt gritty against my skin, as if it had been dusted with something fine and gray. I drifted into a fitful sleep, haunted by dreams of water rising in my lungs and hands reaching out from beneath the surface. I woke suddenly when a sound pierced through the gloom. It was a cry, not a scream of pain, but a rhythmic, sobbing wail that seemed to come from the room directly adjacent to mine. It was high-pitched and melodic, like a woman weeping for something lost in a deep well. The sound was raw, vibrating with an intensity that made my hair stand on end. It did not sound human. It sounded like a recording of a human played back through a cracked speaker. I sat up, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The sobbing continued, steady and rhythmic. I listened intently. Between the cries, there were moments of silence where I could hear something else, a wet, sliding sound, as if something heavy and sodden was being dragged across a floor. Slither, thud, slither, thud. It stopped just outside my door. I sat frozen, my breath held in my chest. The air grew cold, so cold that I could see my own breath misting in the dim light of the dying lamp. Then the sobbing stopped abruptly. I stared at the door. In the silence that followed, I heard a movement. It was the sound of someone or something standing up and moving toward the wall shared with my room. The wood groaned under their weight. I gripped the edge of the mattress, my knuckles white. My imagination began to paint horrific pictures. A figure with elongated limbs, a face distorted by time, waiting for any gap in the wood to slip through. I told myself it was just the wind or a neighbor having a nightmare, but the regularity of the sobbing had been too deliberate for that. Then came the sound that broke my resolve. It was a slow, deliberate scrape against the other side of my door. Scree, scree. It sounded like bone on wood. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for it to stop. But instead of stopping, the noise changed. A soft, rhythmic tapping began. Tap, tap, tap. It was moving along the frame of the door. It felt as though something with many fingers was tracing the outline of the wood. I could feel its presence pressing against the other side, a heavy, suffocating consciousness that seemed to be searching for me. I stayed motionless for what felt like hours, but when I finally risked a glance at the clock, only minutes had passed. The tapping stopped. A new sound emerged, a low, guttural hum. It was a vibration more than a noise, a drone that seemed to originate from the floorboards. It sounded like a hive of bees, deep and buzzing. It moved from my door toward the foot of my bed. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The smell of rot became overwhelming, filling the room until it tasted like copper on my tongue. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch, reaching out toward me like grasping hands. The hum stopped just as my feet touched the floor. In the sudden, absolute silence, I heard a voice. It was not a cry this time, but a whisper. It came from the other side of the door, yet it sounded as if it were spoken directly into my ear. It was a woman's voice, cracked and dry as parchment. She spoke only one word: open. The sound did not come from the hallway. It seemed to emanate from the wood itself. I threw myself back against the headboard, my heart hammering so hard I feared it would burst through my ribs. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in the center of the bed, clutching a heavy brass lamp as if it were a weapon. Every time the house groaned or the wind howled outside, I jumped. The sounds from the next room continued intermittently, the sobbing, the dragging, the humming. They seemed to be a cycle, a ritual performed by whatever lived in the walls of the boarding house. Occasionally, I would hear footsteps in the hall, slow and heavy, moving toward my door and then away again, as if something were patrolling the corridor. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the high window, I realized the room felt different. The air was thicker, more stagnant. When I finally gathered the courage to look at my own reflection in the wash basin, I gasped. My face looked pale, and there were faint, grayish smudges on my forehead as if someone had leaned over me while I slept. I scrubbed at them with trembling hands, but they wouldn't come off. They were under my skin, not on it. I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. The house was not just a building. It was an organism that was slowly absorbing its inhabitants. I stood up and walked toward the door. My legs felt like lead. I needed to leave. I needed to find a way out of this rotting structure before the sun set on the second day. I reached for the handle, but before my fingers could touch the metal, I heard it had been the sobbing from next door. It was louder now, more frantic. It was no longer a single voice. It sounded like dozens of voices crying in unison, a discordant symphony of grief. The wood of the wall between our rooms began to vibrate. Fine cracks appeared in the plaster, and a puff of dust and old hair fell onto my floor. I didn't wait for more. I threw the door open and stumbled into the hallway. I didn't care about the rules or the warnings. I just needed to run. But as I stepped out, the hallway seemed longer than it had been the night before. The doors on either side of me were all wide open now. From behind them, faces began to appear. They weren't people in the way I understood the word. They were pale, sunken features with eyes that had turned into milky white spheres. They stood in their doorways like statues, watching me pass. They didn't move, they just watched with an eerie, hollow intensity. I sprinted toward the stairs, my feet slapping against the rotting wood. I could hear them behind me now, not the sounds of movement, but the sound of many voices whispering my name. Their voices were a chorus of whispers, overlapping and weaving together until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. They weren't chasing me with their bodies, they were chasing me with their voices, trying to pull me into the same static state of existence that had claimed them. I reached the stairs and took them two at a time, my lungs burning. At the bottom of the stairs, the lobby was different. The furniture had been rearranged. There were no chairs now, only piles of old clothes and discarded shoes. The front door was visible at the end of the hall, but it didn't lead outside. Where there should have been a view of Remedios Street, there was only a solid wall of brick and mortar, covered in vines that looked like twisted limbs. I realized with a jolt of horror that the house had changed its geometry. It was folding inward, sealing itself off from the world. The exit was gone. I turned around, and the men who were once behind the desk were now standing at the end of the hallway. They weren't moving toward me, but they were closer than they had been before. Their faces were stretched thin like parchment over their skulls. They held out their hands, and in each palm was a heavy iron key, the same shape as the one I had been given. They didn't speak, but I could hear the collective hum of the house vibrating in my teeth. It wasn't just a building. It was a trap, a reservoir for those who had checked in but never found their way out. The roar of the wind outside seemed to vanish entirely, replaced by an oppressive, tomb-like silence. The air grew thick with the smell of lilies and decay once more. I looked at my hands and saw that they were beginning to turn gray, the skin becoming translucent and dry. I looked at the others, the ones who had never checked out. They weren't victims, they were components. They were parts of the architecture now. The walls were made of their memories, the floorboards from their bones, and the very air was filled with the echoes of their final screams. I tried to scream, but my voice came out as a dry rasp, a sound like paper tearing. I looked at the door to room 4B. It had vanished entirely, replaced by a smooth stretch of wallpaper featuring those same gray, rotting roses. I felt a tug in my mind, a pulling sensation that felt like someone was trying to reach into my skull and rearrange my thoughts. The house was claiming its due. It didn't want me to leave. It wanted me to stay until I became part of the scenery, a permanent resident of the halls of the damned. The light in the hallway began to dim, not because the sun was setting, but because the very concept of light was being absorbed by the walls. I felt my legs grow heavy, my muscles turning to stone. I looked at the men and saw them begin to fade into the background, their forms blending into the wood and plaster until they were indistinguishable from the shadows. I sat down on the floor, the wood feeling soft and yielding beneath me, like flesh. The sound of sobbing began again, but this time it was my own voice. I closed my eyes and heard the heavy thud of a door closing somewhere in the distance. It was the sound of a guest arriving. I could hear their footsteps, the heavy, wet tread of someone seeking shelter from the storm. They were coming down Remedios Street, looking for a place to hide from the rain. They would find the sign, they would see the yellow paint, and they would knock on the door, and when I heard them ask if there was a room available, I would have to answer. My voice would be thin and dry, like falling leaves, as I told them of the quiet rooms and the way the walls held their breath in the dark. I felt my skin harden into something that resembled wood. The smell of lilies filled my lungs until I could no longer breathe air, only the scent of old wax and rot. My thoughts began to slow, becoming part of the house's rhythm. I was no longer a traveler, I was an occupant. The storm outside would continue to rage, but for me, there was only the stillness now. I became a shadow in a hallway, a whisper in a wall, a name on a list that would never be crossed off. The door to my room stayed shut forever, and the next guest would find their key just as heavy and rusted as mine had been. The truth of the Gables was not that it was haunted by ghosts. It was that it was a machine of preservation, a place where time stopped for those who sought refuge from the world's harshness. It took them in when they were tired, and it kept them until they were no longer tired, but simply still. I could hear the next person approaching the front door now. Their footsteps were frantic, their breathing heavy with fear. They would find a room, and they would listen to the sobbing from the wall, and they would think it was just the wind. But eventually, the door would turn on its own, and they would find that the only thing left of the outside world was the memory of a storm they could no longer hear. The shadow of a man appeared at the end of the hall. He looked terrified, his clothes soaked with rain, his eyes wide with panic as he saw the sign over the door. I wanted to scream a warning, to tell him to run, to tell him that the wood was hungry and the walls were listening. But when I opened my mouth, only the sound of falling leaves came out. I watched as he reached for the handle, his hand trembling in the cold air. He took the key from the man behind the desk, a man who had long ago become a pillar of support in the lobby's ceiling. The guest entered the hall, and the house sighed with contentment. It was ready to receive another soul into its fold. The sound of his footsteps began, heavy and desperate, moving toward my section of the corridor. I could see him clearly now, a bright speck of life in the graying world of the gables. He would find room for me eventually. He would hear me crying from behind the wall, and he would think he had found a companion in his loneliness. He would stay for one night, then two, and soon enough his name would be written in the ledger with an ink that never faded. I watched as he stopped before my door. The brass handle turned slowly, the metal groaning in protest. He stepped inside, and the heavy oak door swung shut behind him with a final, definitive thud. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a grave, of a tomb, of a house that had finally filled its quota for the night. I could see his face through the thin partition, twisted in a mixture of curiosity and dread. He took a step toward my wall. I felt the house pulse beneath me, a low-frequency throb that resonated in my bones. The walls began to hum, the deep, buzzing sound of a hive. It was the sound of welcoming. From the other side, he heard the first note of the sobbing. It wasn't my voice anymore. It was both our voices joined together, a harmony of the lost and the found. The lights in the hall flickered once and then went out completely. In the darkness, the only thing visible was the faint, bioluminescent glow of the mold on the walls. I could see him moving toward me, his hand reaching out to touch my side of the partition. His fingers brushed mine through the wood. For a fleeting second, I felt the warmth of his skin, the frantic thrum of his pulse. Then the ground beneath us shifted, and the wall between our rooms began to melt like wax, merging into one continuous space. There was no more next door. There was only the hall, the house, and the eternal night that lay ahead of us both. I could hear him gasp as the ceiling began to descend, not to crush him, but to fold around him like a heavy blanket. He wasn't screaming anymore. He was just breathing in the thick, floral air until his lungs became accustomed to its weight. I reached out and took his hand. It felt cold, like a piece of driftwood pulled from the river. We were no longer separate entities struggling against the storm. We were two notes in the same song, becoming part of the house's architecture. The distinction between us was fading, our memories blending into the floorboards and the rafters. The storm outside finally broke, the wind dying down to a moan, and the rain thinning to a mist. The residents of Remedios Street would wake up the next morning and find the gables standing silent under a gray sky. They would see its yellow paint peeling and its windows dark, but they would not know that inside, the house was full. They wouldn't hear the sobbing or the humming, for those sounds were now part of the structure itself. They wouldn't see the new faces and the shadows of the hallway, nor would they notice how the portraits on the walls seemed a little more lifelike each passing year. A traveler would eventually come again, driven by exhaustion or fear, seeking refuge from the world's noise. They would find the sign and feel the heavy key in their palm. They would walk through the door and enter the hall where we waited. They would hear the sobbing from the wall and think it was the wind. And when they reached for the handle of my room, I would be there to answer them. Not as a person, but as a part of the house's very soul, a voice in the wood, a presence in the shadow. The door would turn on its own, the latch would click with a finality that echoed through the halls, and the cycle would begin anew, fueled by the quiet consumption of those who never checked out. The last thing I felt was the sensation of my thoughts turning into stone, the memories of the wind, The smell of rain and the sight of the sea were being replaced by the steady pulse of the house's heart. My name was fading, becoming just another line in a ledger that no one would ever read again. I became a pillar, a beam, a stretch of wallpaper. I became a part of the gables. And as the new guest sat on the edge of my bed, listening to the ticking of the clock, they felt a sudden, strange sense of peace. They closed their eyes and listened to the sobbing from next door, not realizing that it was the only voice left in the world that knew what it felt like to be alive under the gray sky of Remedios Street. The house sighed, its timbers settling into place, satisfied with another tenant who had found a home that would never let them leave.